Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program from the Sattva Project, Open Heart, Open Mind. Just a thank you to our sponsors, Dream Homes, Durian FM, and Durian ASEAN. So tonight, our discussion will be concerning mental health in the times of the pandemic, which is particularly relevant to all of us who are still living through this period in history, quite unique to our era. And tonight we have a wonderful panel of four speakers who I will be discussing with mental health and care during the pandemic. So on the first, one of our first speakers shall be, here they come. So for the first speaker we've got Cat Liu. She studied psychology, organizational psychology, and occupation through health, high intensity, psychological therapies, and worked in the NHS in the United Kingdom for over 8 years with those who live with chronic and severe mental illnesses. So she currently works in the IAPT service as a qualified cognitive behavioral psychotherapist. And she aims to gain full accreditation with BABCP UK by the end of this year. So I'd like to just very much welcome Kat. Thank you so much for joining us in tonight's discussion.
Thanks a lot for having me, Raymond, and I look forward to sharing some interesting discussion with everybody today.
That's amazing. Can't wait. Thank you. Thank you for your time. So the next speaker we have is Karl LaRowe. He's a licensed mental health therapist and certified as a mental health investigator and examiner. He has extensive experience in mental health as a crisis intervention specialist, therapist, program manager, clinical director, and expert witness in court commitment hearings. He's an international speaker who has conducted over 1,000 workshops to more than 50,000 professionals on 3 continents on how to transform stress and exhaustion into positive energy and empowerment. He's the best-selling author of Breath of Relief, Transforming Compassion Fatigue into Flow, and co-author of You Are Good Enough, Embracing Who You Really Are. He's an HRDF trainer and the industry advisor for the Master of Psychology Industrial and Organizational Psychology program in UTAR. Karl, welcome, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, Raymond. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to the discussion.
Brilliant, brilliant. So our third speaker is Patricia Snider. Hi, Patricia. She's certified clinical counselor with the prestigious CCC designation from the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association. She's a registered clinical counselor, RCC, with the British Columbia Association of Clinical Counselors. And she's been a somatic and wellness practitioner for over 30 years. She holds a number of academic qualifications, including a Master in Counseling, a Master of Divinity in Pastoral Counseling, an advisory diploma in holistic counseling, and graduate diploma in Buddhist psychotherapy, and a master in Buddhist studies. Welcome, Patricia. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Raymond. Pleasure to be here.
So as you can see, we have just a wonderful panel. Let's move on to the fourth one. So the next one, our final panelist and guest is Adrian Pereira. He is the executive director and co-founder of North-South Initiative, a human rights and social justice-oriented organization based in Malaysia. Before setting his organization up, Adrian worked with 2 UN-accredited international organizations, Pax Romana International Movement of Catholic Students, IMCS, and Dignity International. Having studied at Royal Military College in Malaysia, he had the experience of living in an environment which celebrates diversity and harmony beyond superficial and artificial levels. This has helped him with the framing of his worldview. The NSI has developed competent migrant and refugee leaders who can document evidence of human rights and labor violations. Welcome, Adrian. It's a wonderful pleasure to have you tonight.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Wonderful. So we've got 4 panelists in total, and sadly, we have one co-moderator who couldn't join us tonight, Dr. Carrie Yang. So I'll be your sole moderator tonight. But we have several wonderful questions which I would like to perhaps give the floor to the speakers to discuss. And I hope you'll enjoy this open and intellectually stimulating and enriching forum. Please don't forget to share if you're able to on our social media. We have our Facebook page, and enjoy. So let's start with the first question. Since we're really discussing a pertinent topic in this period of human history, can each speaker highlight in just a few words what they found unique about the nature of the decline in mental health during this pandemic? Who would like to start first? Perhaps I'll start with Cat.
Thank you for letting me go first. Well, thanks so much for having me today. That's totally cool. And you know what? It's like that throughout this year. I think we're always kind of put on the spot sometimes unexpectedly, like the pandemic, the COVID. It's like, oh, what do we do then? So it's a really good start in terms of looking at what's been unique about this period and what our experiences have been. Well, I'm based in England. So at the moment, we've got the vaccine happening. However, from where I've been working, there's been an increase in referrals for accessing support with mental health problems, which I find actually quite helpful because people are now sort of starting to learn to break the stigma and reach out and recognize it's important actually to take care of our own mind and hearts. So we expect that, we can have a scratch or a cut or a bruise physically. Why would it be so abnormal that our brain and our minds can be bruised and hurt by the current environment, as well as physical issues? So, so that's kind of like maybe a positive reflection on maybe some of the benefits that's come out from this period. However, unfortunately, I don't know what the stats are like all over the world, but in England, the homelessness for the young people has increased. Domestic abuse, the things that are happening just when people are not allowed to, not that they're not allowed, but the restrictions in meeting people and going out has been reduced. You might be stuck with people that you're having a lot of challenge with, and that can get a little bit more difficult when you don't have that space to think or solve issues around your areas. So domestic abuse and things like that, unfortunately, the numbers have increased as well. But yeah, so I'm not sure this is a unique experience, to be honest, because I think we all kind of share similar experiences in our different countries. I know there's in Malaysia, UAE, our speakers will be able to share a little bit more information on that. But maybe the question is, what isn't unique sometimes? So I don't know what people think, and I'm sure audience who are listening out there, they'll have really interesting views as well. So I think we'll love to hear their comments, because I think we all agree as a panel, we love to hear from audience and sort of interact with them. So yeah, I'm not sure, what does Karl, Patricia, or Adrian think?
Well, I'd like to go next, and thank you, Kat, for sharing, because you brought up some really good points. And to me, it seems to me, in my way of thinking, that this is a little bit unique, at least from my perspective. The way in which it happened, the pandemic happened so suddenly. It came down in a way that very few of us have the sense of control. And I know even myself experiencing it, I feel helpless sometimes. I'm not able to do the things that I normally do. I feel restricted. I feel frightened. In fact, I think the kind of stress we're experiencing today is a little bit beyond ordinary stress. It's traumatic stress. because of the way in which this pandemic developed and the effect that it's having on us. I was doing a little research about stress, and the World Health Organization says right now, before the pandemic, stress was the second leading cause of disability worldwide, which is incredible when you think about it. The number one cause is actually depression. And I'm certain that the pandemic has increased and intensified both stress and depression. And some of the other studies I was looking at are the number of anxiety disorders and panic disorders and post-traumatic stress disorders as a result of this ongoing sense that, you know, all of these restrictions and even fear for my life and maybe knowing somebody who's lost their life, all of that fear, I think is going to be with us for a while. Even when the vaccines come out, my concern is that we're going to be dealing with this for a while because traumatic stress, as you know, it etches itself in our nervous system in a different way. And I think we're going to have more incidences of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, domestic violence, and some of these other things that come up as a result of what we're experiencing today. So I think it's a major thing. I can't personally remember in my life where I had such a tremendous change happen so quickly and without my having any influence over it, really.
That's a great point. Really great points raised by a speaker so far. Patricia, might you be able to answer this question next?
Yeah,
I think she's kind of frozen in time.
Yeah, it looks like her internet's frozen again.
All right, we'll get that. I'm sure our wonderful people behind will get that fixed. Adrian, can we move on to you?
Sure. So thanks for having me on the panel. If you have seen everyone's profile, I'm a bit one of the odd ones out. So I've been doing human rights and social justice work for some time. And in the last 6 to 7 years, working with migrants and refugees. And before the pandemic, the migrants and the refugee communities have already been under quite extreme stress due to the different types of environment, the challenges, more specifically the rights abuses. And during the pandemic, as the economy tries to recover, as the corporate world tries to catch up on lost profits, I can see some of that burdens transferred to the community members, the workers. And a more specific example is if you look at the domestic workers, as everybody is locked up in the house due to the movement control order or the lockdowns, that pressure cooker in the house, a lot of that burden is passed to them. So we can see the impacts, people breaking down. We have seen suicides. Of course, I don't really have the accurate statistics, but you can see worker suicides happening among some migrant communities. The physical fights, we get more reports on physical fights, either between the communities or between the migrants and Malaysians. So, and also if you look at the women NGOs reports, domestic violence has kind of increased quite significantly in the sense of they get more reports. So these are some of my small observations on the ground, and hopefully I can learn from all the panelists here.
Thank you so much for sharing your views. Patricia was briefly offline. Now, Patricia, would you please be able to share some of your thoughts on the unique nature of this pandemic, as other panelists have discussed?
And I'm sorry, my internet fell out there. So if I'm repeating, please forgive me. Mention stress the impact of stress. And I guess the uniqueness is pretty unique. And how it affects individuals is also very unique. For example, for a person who's suffering already from refugees, whom I also worked with and am currently working with, that is, well, you know,
I think she's frozen again.
Oh no. Yes, I believe Pat is breaking up. Can one of our people behind the scenes ask Patricia to see if there might be anything wrong with her connection? I'm afraid we'll have to move on to the next question.
Well, I'd like to make a comment. Oh, okay, she's back, and then I'd sort of like to make a follow-up comment. But go ahead, Patricia.
Sure. Patricia, how's the connection?
I don't know how much you heard, but I was talking about suffering in a way that may be different from other people, in that their survival issues are impacted. And so, you know, the government has had a way of handling this pandemic, which has impacted them directly. They're vulnerable. Not only can't they go out because of lockdown, but if they do go out, they run the risk of deportation. So what we're seeing is stressors that are multiplied. So I guess that really is the uniqueness of this. It's like, well, we're not dealing with our usual mental health issues, but we're dealing with the exacerbation due to COVID. Karl, you wanted to
say yeah. I did. I was just thinking as people were talking, you know, here's another unique aspect of this, which has been like any other time in history, as far as I can tell, is our social media. Not only is the virus contagious, so is all of the negative stress and all of the talk and all of the energy that goes into talking about the virus and how it's impacted our social media, and how the social media has literally amplified a social virus on top of the actual medical virus. And so this is, I think, one aspect that's extremely unique, particularly to young people, and where people get their information and how they share it. And there's this whole other aspect of secondary traumatic stress. We're not only stressed out by the trauma itself, we're secondarily stressed out and traumatized by the social media, by all the news coverage, which impacts and reinforces that stress response all over again. So it becomes sort of this triggering response that gets continually triggered over and over again. And I think this is my big concern about how it's going to impact our mental health for a period of time. Because if you think about it, even when we get our vaccines, we've had to confront our mortality. We've had to confront that we're not as powerful as we would like to think that we are. We've had to confront that our lives can change at a moment's notice. We've had to confront just how hopeless, or how helpless, and sometimes maybe even hopeless, but how helpless we've been to have a direct impact on this pandemic. And I think that that's going to stick with us for a period of time. And it concerns me because people are going to go, well, I'm getting better. I've got my vaccine now. I don't need to process all of these things that happened to me. And I think people are going to need to process this for a period of time.
We're seeing a mental health curve like we've never seen before.
Yeah.
fantastic.
It's interesting that on the heels of what Karl was just saying, how do we cope with social media and its negativity? It's interesting that the United Nations has designated a day now as the International Day of Happiness. Hopefully that we can bring awareness to it by doing so, removing the stigma through some positivity, so that we can help people to find joy in other ways.
I think that's a really good point, actually. Sorry, you were saying, Patricia?
No, I was just going to talk about brain chemistry, but we can get into that later. Yeah.
No, that sounds interesting, because I think what you and Karl has really done so well highlighting is actually mentioning the word trauma as well, and the uniqueness in terms of the intensity of the mental illness that we go through. Because often I feel people, even myself, we think automatically trauma means the veterans, the war. It belongs to that category.
Yeah. Well, it can be anything that you experienced when you were a child, and you're even unknown. It's unknown to you. Right. And it can show up in very unfortunate ways at times when you would least expect it. So it's during COVID, I think Karl would agree, this is what we're seeing, how this COVID has exacerbated all of that.
Think of how many times we get triggered by all the things that we see and that we hear and that we're feeling, and that isolation, and how much we need people at this point, and having to confront these, this horrible sense of frailty that, that it could impact me and that it's impacted my family. I think it's triggering a lot of people in ways that we're not even understanding.
Yeah, and for those who suffer from anxiety, anything from GAD to other disorders, they can suffer from real panic.
Yes.
But these are very normal response, though, to have anxiety and depression during this time. To have that abnormal response is a normal response for an abnormal situation, an event. And especially what Karl's saying in terms of the social media, there's a bit of catch-22 where you're socially isolated and then you're trying to find that connection online, but then you're being bombarded with all these different information that might not be as healthy. And I mean, I don't know how Adrian's working with that in terms of looking at people who've been, especially with domestic violence or being locked in an area or, restricted to have access to get the support they need compared to before. Or amid that frustration, how it can make people a little bit more aggressive, perhaps sometimes, so they don't have that space to release that energy and anger. I mean, how would we be able to? I don't know. How have you?
Yeah, you know what, Kat? I think that's really good. You're pointing to the need for education. We need to tell people to, for example, be careful what you read.
Yes.
And only take it from certain sources, and so on, teaching them how to befriend happiness, what kind of coping skills are helpful rather than unhelpful, and so on.
And this can be a time where we start paying attention to our feelings more, pay attention to our sensations more, more body awareness, somatic awareness, and begin to listen to ourselves a little bit more. And it's also a time where I find that I have to make time for myself and to not allow myself to get completely run over with everybody else's needs and all of the craziness that's going on, but to develop certain basic kinds of life rituals that I have for myself. Such as getting up at a certain time, having a right amount of exercise, spending some time in meditation. And for me, especially self-compassion has been extremely important. Learning to practice and to be compassionate with myself, more understanding, and to not be angry or impatient with myself when I don't feel well, when I feel anxious and I feel upset, and to also try to extend that to others. Because I think that sense of patience and kindness and compassion is something that will really help us get through this, maybe even learn to grow from it, because there is, the concept of post-traumatic growth. And I think at our best, we can look at this as an opportunity to grow. And if I can get through this all intact and learn how to treat myself well under these conditions and treat other people with kindness, that would be tremendous growth.
Exactly. So you're really talking about the gift in everything.
Yeah.
How everything, no matter how difficult, has its gift, and how do we come to to appreciating the gift, and maybe even settling into some gratitude around that.
Yes.
To developing an attitude of gratitude in our lives, even though we're in lockdown. Can we experience the fullness and accept it, as you say, accepting the sensations, or accepting what this is offering, what goodness is coming for it. I think that when we actually nourish or nurture the gratitude, this gratitude within, then less dissatisfaction is present.
Yeah.
We're not saying I want this or I have to have that, and yeah. So where possible,
Adrian,
just be more grateful.
Yeah. Adrian, I think one of the great fears that the people that you deal with and work with have is actually causing a lot of anxiety with them. What observations have you found in the people that you work with that are related to what Cat, Patricia, and Karl have been discussing?
Yeah. So one thing that when we bring the cases to the public sphere or to different bodies, I think there's a big lack in competency in the different agencies who deal with this. So you may have someone who gets physically assaulted, and there's no real mechanism to help them cope. And for me, this is very worrying, because already some of the Asian societies look at the mental health issues as taboo, and it won't be so easy to help people to even report what they are experiencing. Sharing what they're experiencing, maybe, but it depends on the community leaders who are facilitating. So for me, the workers, especially, being in very enclosed areas, trying to bring them out into a space where they can share freely, on top of having the right facilitation tools to help them share. These are very big gaps, and I'm really quite worried. Hopefully, forums like this bring us together and help us to exchange ideas. But we still need to go to the ground and look and test out some of the signs. I think there's a mention about the brain science or something like that. So that is what I hope. Whatever I learn from here and share, we can then move forward and look into these issues. But there's also the factor of there's a lot of economic issues that are causing some of this stress. And how do you get individuals who are, or families who are like caught in their own bubbles to struggle with this alone? For me and my team, when we do our outreach, we, even in the pursuit for justice, we tell communities that, hey, we don't have the solutions in black and white, but we together, if we come together, we there is a chance that we can overcome some of these problems, and it's not totally hopeless. But if you look at the number of actors who are willing to push that barriers, it's very few. And for me, that's what's worrying. Do we have the quantity? Quality, of course, is the competency issue to deal with this issue. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so we've actually touched on the fact that now many more people around the world are aware of mental health. Given that I think everyone has had experience of a unique, different kind of headspace since the pandemic began. But I'd still like to pose to you all a more general question. And each of you, I'm sure, will have unique perspectives on what are some of the misunderstandings and misperceptions of mental health and working with people living with mental health. I think you can each give an example, if any, in your practice or work, and highlight how such misunderstandings hold back progress or hurt and harm people. So may I start with Cat, and we'll go around. Cat, Karl, Patricia, and then Adrian. Shall we? Cat.
Sure. So, yeah, for me, in terms of misunderstanding, I think this is something that's been perhaps shaped by our history, culture, the media. And so it's might be common for a lot of people. I know early on for myself as well, reaching out for help is a sign of weakness. Or my automatic thought is, oh my God, I'm so weak, I'm reaching out for help. What are my people going to think about me? Will they keep me at my job if I let them know that I'm struggling? So my point is, if we look at physical health, like if we break, let's say, our leg, and we go to the doctors and we have physiotherapy for it, what's going to be our automatic thought? Would it be, oh, you're so weak, you're going to the doctors to fix your legs. We can't trust you to do your work because you're doing some physiotherapy and taking time off to heal that leg. Is that how we approach things? And I'm thinking, if that's not how we approach, because I can see Karl nodding, maybe he knows that maybe a lot of us, I don't know if our audience would like to make a comment and say if that's a common thing that we do, when people have physical illness, we think, you know what, brilliant, you're wise, you're strong for reaching out for help so that you can recover and continue your life. So if we can have that approach, why would it be so weird to think, you know what, you're feeling stressed and you're down, your circumstances have got to where you are at the moment, you're going to find a way to have some protected time, to use your own resources to help yourself heal and be happy and help other people as well. That's what therapy is about. That's what taking some medication, reaching out and talking to people, that's what you're trying to do. You're just trying to improve your own current situation. How is that weak? How is that not being strong? Especially when there's so many stigma around and people misunderstanding us. Yeah, even 10 times stronger, I would say, for people to reach out, because there's a lot of perhaps misunderstanding, discrimination around that compared to physical health. So I would say that's one of the huge misunderstandings we have, where we think that actually our physical health is very different from our mental health. But actually, you know what? Even if we're very rich and we're physically fit, if we're not healthy, we're not going to do our jobs well if we can't concentrate and we can't focus. Yeah. So this is actually the source of our wisdom. So is it not actually a really helpful thing to reach out and find resources to upskill ourselves? So I don't know what other people think in terms of what other misunderstandings we might experience.
Karl. What are your thoughts?
I can share it from a couple of different perspectives. When I worked as a mental health investigator and examiner, I would work with people who were detained in a mental health facility against their will because they're believed to be dangerous to themselves or others. And for them, carrying around a diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar or one of these other diagnoses was very difficult for them. Their families often shunned them. Their friends wouldn't have anything to do with them. They felt like there was a mark on their face that everyone could see. And it really made the recovery process quite difficult. They didn't want to take the medication, didn't want to attend the therapy sessions. And so there were many, many examples in my work of seeing that. As a person myself who has a mental illness, it took me quite some time, even as a therapist, before I would admit it. I used to work in a busy emergency room with a lot of depressed people, and that secondary trauma triggered my own depression. And it wasn't until I had actually attempted suicide that I finally began treatment myself. And my therapist was, his first question was, why didn't you seek treatment earlier? And I couldn't come to the realization, to allowing myself to see that I needed help, even as I was trying to help other people in the emergency room. So the real kind of sense of appreciation for why people are very hesitant to carry this, to sort of admit their problem and to be able to share it with others.
Patricia?
Thank you for sharing that, Karl. And I truly relate to what you're saying. You know, stigma comes from both fear and judgment. And I personally have experienced it in the family. Both my father and my husband, my late husband, suffered from schizophrenia. And as a child, this brought great shame to the family. And so when you described it as something one wears, that's exactly right. You know, now for me, I chose to befriend it, I guess is a way of saying it, and to work with it. And today, I'm a mindfulness teacher, and compassionate teacher. So it was my way around it. So both through MICBT, which is Mindfulness Integrated CBT, and MBSR. Those are the two mainstay tools in my toolkit, both for myself and for the people. So, you know, I just say that as a mindfulness teacher, I know that to be true, that the efficacy of mindfulness and how it can actually counter these harsh judgments and fear. So that by applying mindfulness and cultivating compassion, we can help ourselves to overcome this judgment. And the more that we can teach this, you know, it's like planting seeds of awareness, planting seeds of kindness, of non-judgment, of patience, you know, all of those wonderful attitudes that we can actually grow our self-compassion and understanding. And then, you know, have it go out to help the suffering. And as we do that, our society begins to drop stigma.
Thank you, Pat. Adrian, would you like to follow up on the views shared so far?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest or tragic misunderstanding about mental illness is that you're not accepted into certain labor forces. So for the communities I work with, like migrants, if they during their medical tests, if they find out that you're medical that you have a psychosis or some kind of mental illness, it's almost definitely that you're going to lose your job. So it's very unfortunate that we don't have a compassionate response, as I think there's enough, we should by now have enough science and tools to respond and help people heal and come back into the workforce and function, because all of the people we have economic duties to our families, and to be cut off doesn't really solve the problem. It adds on more pressure to the individuals, to the families, and I've seen some very very uncompassionate acts where people are given 1 day to leave their houses if they can't pay a rent. But the beautiful thing about this lockdown during the COVID is there's also this strange thing of complete strangers helping complete strangers. Now, how does that happen? What logic? It defies every logic. And for me, that gives me a bit of hope that we can go beyond just the physical health, but helping people to cope with these complexities. And in Asia, I don't know why in Asia, the topic is still so taboo. Till today, there are people from religious backgrounds who will say, yeah, it's some bad spirit, it's an evil spirit, you need to go for some kind of a different type of healing. Now, I'm not saying or berating that the traditional healers, but we don't really have a more systematic way to deal with it. And I think this is a meeting point where both worlds need to meet and decide how to help people with mental health conditions. Yeah.
So Adrian just led on to my one of my favorite questions coming up, and it has to do with spirituality, and it's this. So I don't know, I'm sure most of you would have heard of spiritual bypassing. And as far as I've got on the notes here, the term was introduced in the early 1980s by a Buddhist teacher and psychotherapist, John Wellwood. And he defined it as a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. So, my question, and we've got about 20 to 15 minutes left, so I think this would serve as a good, healthy, and challenging question for our panelists to sort of close up on and unite the mental health and religion aspects. What have you experienced examples of this spiritual bypassing, and more importantly, how do you think we should move towards guiding the Buddhist community or other religious communities, wherever you may be situated, into a more holistic and healthy framework in which both the spiritual needs and the emotional needs are integrated? So I've been following on from Adrian's questions, but we'll go around in another circle. Cat, if you would be so kind, would you kick us off a little bit with that question?
Oh, thanks, Raymond. That is quite an interesting question you've asked there, because it's only recently that I've actually been familiar with the term spiritual bypass. I don't think people have labeled that before when they were talking to me about it. So that's really interesting, and it sounds like maybe it's a topic that people may find helpful to be more aware of. So just let me have a think, because in terms of looking at what we've been discussing so far, it sounds like it's really important, first of all, to acknowledge, just like Karl and Patricia saying, actually recognizing it is traumatic. There are traumas that we experience. It's actually kind of a norm, unfortunately, especially during this time. And that actually using self-compassion is a very, it can be easy, it can be hard at times, but actually doesn't have to be rocket science, but a really helpful way to make a huge impact. And just like Adrian was saying, you know, strangers helping stranger already itself can be something very doable and have a huge positive consequence on our own well-being as well as other people. And drawing from those points, I think those are really helpful in terms of looking at spiritual bypass as well, because essentially what it is to me, it speaks to me where actually what we're doing is we're avoiding our problems. We're finding ways to avoid facing our problems. So I think Patricia is saying stigma is around fear and judgment. And often that happens when we don't understand something thoroughly enough or have a way to accept things. And so when we are going through different situations that are really hard to handle, avoidance is a very common response. Anybody who's anxious, they might turn the conversation around or avoid. If you're scared of dogs, you avoid dogs. Yeah. So if you're going through a lot in your situation in your life, of course you're going to find ways and try and find helpful ways to manage it. But avoidance sometimes can prolong our fear or turn into a problem. So perhaps maybe spiritual bypass is relating to where somebody is misusing the spiritual support to help them hide some of their problems. And so, I think I would be quite interested to hear how the other panelists would view in terms of what that means to them and what kind of support people can have around that, because this is still something that I'm still thinking about and reading more on as well.
Karl.
I've not heard the term actually spiritual bypass, so it's new to me. But as you were describing it, it reminded me of when I first started working in Singapore about 30 years ago. I was working with a halfway house for women with mental illness. Many of these women had been in and out of the hospital with schizophrenia or some other form of severe mental illness. And probably about 50 or 60% of them had seen, I think they called them a BOMO at that time, or an alternate healer. And I just heard some stories about some of the things that they were asked to do, or some of the cures that they were subjected to. And for some, it seemed to be somewhat traumatic for them, because very often they would decompensate again and end up back in the hospital and start the whole cycle over again. So if spiritual bypassing is this way to sort of dissociate from my problem, or from my internal schema that is giving me such difficulty, then it's something that I would see as not really effective, because that disconnection, I don't think it can be really helpful in the long term. I think sometimes people dissociate as a way to get a bit of distance from their problems. I've experienced that myself. As someone who's experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, there is that tendency to get outside of yourself and to try to compartmentalize those traumatic experiences, but they were not effective in the long run. So I think that's as close to the idea of spiritual bypassing I can come to.
Patricia, is there could you please share with us anything about your experience with, or possibly client's experience of spiritual bypass, or the idea?
I guess was there more to the question though? Were you talking about, because this was your favorite question, Raymond, so I want to make sure we get everything in.
It was a fairly general question, in the sense that how yes, you're right, in the sense that what would be what would, in your view, be a feasible, practical, and healthy way to bring together the concepts of the good spiritual life and the good emotional life? Because as in my own experience, and as perhaps in other people's experience, there is a tendency in some communities to exhibit ways of dealing with mental health that resemble spiritual bypass, as per the definition that I read out. Now, I'm sure the concept has actually advanced over time. This was in the 1980s, but I just asked that as a general question and pose it to you and to others as who might be either practitioners themselves or in contact with Buddhist practitioners or spiritually practicing people of any kind.
So it's interesting that that each religion, as we know it in monotheism, has its own god, to its own godhead, let's say, and with each religion, and please don't. I don't want to get, I don't want to upset anybody here, but let's say that every religion has its dogma. Yes, can we agree? But the beautiful thing is that on just a spiritual level, on the highest level of each of those religions, we all seem to come together in our sense of oneness. And so I've known people from every religion that we would say practices spiritual bypass. I know yoga teachers who practice spiritual bypass. Now it's not done intentionally, but spiritual bypass is actually unhelpful because, as Cat said, it can lead to real pathology. Avoidance can lead to real pathology. Now we want to avoid something dangerous. This isn't avoidance. But when we avoid something in our lives that needs to be looked at, listened to, accepted, befriended, worked with, we don't want to be avoiding those things because nasty things are going to happen. But people don't intentionally say, I'm spiritually bypassing. They're quite unconscious about the act. They're just simply turning to something they think they're getting help with. They're turning to a helpful solution, finding refuge in. So again, it's about education, isn't it? What is really helpful? What isn't helpful? Is this helping me turn towards the difficulty? Or is it helping me to run away from the difficulty? Very practical. It's not rocket science, but it is brain science. And if we don't attend to our brain chemistry, then we're bypassing, whether you want to call it spiritual or otherwise. So, I'm a practicing Buddhist. And I would say that a Buddha, he was the first psychologist. He was the first to say, and this is like 2,600 years ago, he was the first to say, let's check the sense doors. Sit with yourself. What do you feel? What do you hear? What do you see? What do you taste? What do you touch? You see? So these sense doors take us to truth, and they help us to understand ourselves better. There's no bypassing in that.
That's fantastic analysis, Patricia. Adrian, I had deliberately tied this last question to your points earlier. So, aside from the evil spirits and the ghosts and all that stuff, when they bring this up to you, or when people share the stories of them being told to go see the local exorcist or something like, or whatever, what would you advise them what can you do to, as Patricia reminded me, the idea of bringing together the two worlds of religion and mental wellness?
So my background is from the Catholic student movement, and it's a bit progressive as it looks into the liberation theology and social justice aspect.
Liberation, yes.
But previously, I was a regular church goer, and my parents were into the charismatic and very what they use a lot of music and hype to in what they would say healing processes. So some of this made me question, and as I saw some of my friends getting into a kind of spiritually high condition where they were not really solving their problems. So those were things that I would see in front of my eyes happen over years and years. So we then raised it to the church leaders. We had dialogues, debates, and fortunately, there was also a group of intellectuals, for example, the Jesuits, who had already over hundreds of years kind of developed tools to help with the self-examination, for example. But they didn't encourage this to be done alone. It was always bringing people together, doing it in cell groups. And this really helped us go deeper than superficial solutions to whatever mental health issues people were going through. And then, of course, we met also along the way feminist theologians who introduced us to the dance of liberation, where we help people with trauma through group processes, release. And I've seen the transformation people face. So I'm not saying that the religion or spirituality has to be that only tool where they bypass, but we know some people or some tools who have actually enhanced the way we look and deal with this question. So unfortunately, in Asia, religion is still so blindly followed. It will be a challenge to look at this. But hopefully, as we professionalize this field of mental health, get more people involved, the reality is not everyone will have access to psychiatry or a counselor or even a therapist. I think it's changing slowly. People, more and more friends of mine. I'm 1980s baby, so millennial, Gen X, I think. So more and more people are getting more comfortable in reaching out to therapists and getting help, but still a long way to go to normalize this. Yeah, that's a bit of my response.
Cheap access to mental health services seems like a no-brainer in this sense. Otherwise, there's no point. You're only looking at a small echelon of people who can access a psychotherapist or a counselor. But in any case, I think we're approaching the end of the forum. I'd like to, as just a all-round round of good wishes to our audience, whether tuning in live or watching in the future. Could I ask each of our esteemed speakers to give a little tip on mentally caring for yourself during this pandemic? Something that perhaps you might feel would be of use to others. Cat, would you be sorry for putting this up? Can you start us off? just brief, just a little nugget of wisdom. And that will be good.
Thank you so much, Raymond. No, I'd rather start off because if I follow afterwards, it's huge boots I can't fill.
Yeah,
so it's great to
you've
start.
got a lot riding.
So more flexible for me to start. So in terms of self-care, I always tend to remind myself it's a bit like a beach ball. You know when you push a beach ball underneath water? I don't know if anyone's done that before. They push the beach ball really hard underneath water. What happens? Just bounces right to your face, doesn't it? Exactly what Adrian's doing there. So, and that's the same thing when I'm feeling hard, when I'm feeling difficult and I'm so self-critical. and I'm feeling really stressed, I remind myself, if I push myself and try and get rid of that feeling, like I'm trying to push the ball underneath water, yeah, maybe temporarily I won't feel that bad. But any little touch, somebody tap me on the shoulder, the water moves a little bit, the ball's just going to shoot back up in my face 10 times stronger. And that's the same thing. If I avoid my feelings, not talk about it, and even criticize and suppress it, I'm going to feel worse. And it's going to get even worse later on. And so I think even just having that awareness, and what Patricia was just saying before, having that kind awareness, knowing, that education, already just being aware and knowing that you're criticizing yourself or you're being kind to yourself, that's the first step in taking care of yourself. And as Karl was saying, in terms of self-compassion, I think that's a key word to think about and even research about, because often we think, oh, paying any little attention to ourselves means we're selfish. And that is so not true. And I love Karl's website as well. He's got really good information, and I know he's got a really good book as well about self-compassion. So that I'm not trying. Actually, I didn't really think of talking about this, and he didn't pay for me to say this. But I would say that's one of those ways to self-care as well. Have a read of his book. But it's we have all these resources here, and as you said, Raymond, having more kind of free therapy is actually really important. That's why I'm so lucky to be in England, where they roll this system out as a part of NHS, where actually you don't need to pay to access low intensity kind of psychological therapy. So so that's kind of like my some of the ideas, in terms of maybe reaching out, looking at self-compassion, just even thinking about that word, or just realizing that you're maybe suppressing your feelings sometimes. And as Patricia said, just maybe have a look and be aware. That might be a good start.
Yeah. Karl, any tips for our listeners, for our viewers?
Well, thank you, Cat, for bringing that up. Not just the website, but the whole topic of self-compassion, because I really think that this is key. I think we tend to be so hard on ourselves, the way in which we talk about ourselves inside of our heads, or even when we're talking about somebody else inside of our own heads, we're still impacting ourselves. So sometimes we have those angry conversations about someone else and they're not there, but we're experiencing it. So whether it's to myself directly or it's about somebody else, it's still inside my head and it's still impacting me. To catch that, to release it, I try to do a little physical release with breath and rotating my shoulders and imagining all of that stress and tightness coming out, taking a couple of mindful breaths, and then actually I'll put one hand on my heart and one on my stomach and just allow myself to feel a sense of safety and compassion and kindness and appreciation for who I am for just a couple of minutes, just to center in on that. And it makes a huge difference for me, because I find myself just being more accepting of the person that I am rather than trying to be something that I'm not. And that's really why we wrote the book, You Are Good Enough, because who we are truly is good enough. We don't have to be something that we're not.
Wonderful. Patricia.
Thank you, Karl. That's a lovely reminder. I would say to recognize our suffering is the beginning. Just to recognize I'm suffering. To be kind to ourselves and others. And I agree with Karl, to develop skill around pausing your thoughts, managing your feelings, maybe lowering your expectations. And know that your breath is your best friend. It's the one you came in with, it's the one you'll go out with. And when you gather your attention on your breath, magic happens.
I think That's wonderful. That's really amazing. Thank you, Patricia. Adrian, you're the last.
So the reason why I mentioned my background in a military college is because we are really trained to think in a particular way that can be so harmful, and the structures within the system, and that really opened my eyes to how dangerous certain ways of thinking, a kind of very toxic environment of almost sadomasochism, and it was a lot of I had a lot of feminist friends who helped me to break out from conditions where we kept punishing ourselves, and which was crazy, and we did it for years and years. So that being authentic to ourselves, being able to peel that layers of what society says we should be, how the media says we should be. I think we shouldn't take for granted that even ourselves, our friends, our family members are breaking through those things. And one of the tools that helped me, I think the Jesuits have a tool called the Examen every night and every morning when we wake up to do a list, like a kind of checklist, how we felt, what were the good things, what we can improve. It's kind of helpful to get in touch with ourselves, and then a bit more recently, Reiki. I found Reiki very helpful to refocus my energy and get back on track. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for all of our esteemed guests, Cat, Karl, Patricia, Adrian. I think this is a fairly sensitive subject that can leave us all feeling a little bit vulnerable. But I think that's a great thing that it allows us to, share openly, the reality of what the pandemic has sort of brought to the forefront. It's not to say that these mental issues didn't, popped out of nowhere. They've always been there, as you've very articulately pointed out in your work and in your own personal lives. But now there's an urgent need to double down on the focus and sort of examine these issues at a wider mass scale, if I understand correctly. And so I'd just like to thank everyone for their generous offering of time tonight. And I hope our viewers, both present and future, will take something very enriching, healing, and meaningful from this Sattva dialogue seminar. So thank you all, and wish you all a very good morning, afternoon, evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night. Good night.